Everyone, thank you so much for taking your time out today on what is a beautiful Melbourne day today. Welcome to our first Wellness by the Water Cooler for 2025. We're so excited to be back for this series. We have a lot installed this year around these wonderful sessions and even beyond the current format that we're currently using right now. And we know this can be a really saturated space and people can get a bit wary of webinars here and there. But what we also know and we love is it's just such a great way to share some beautiful insights and key takeaways and highlight some of the country's best experts, including your lovely self today, Brock. We should mention, if any time you want to get in touch with Superfriend to learn more about how we support the workplaces in mental health, please do so. Steph will put some more information in the chat today. And also just keep in mind, if your workplace's default super fund is one of our superannuation partners, we have a huge range of resources that you can access completely free. So again, Steph will actually put some information in the chat today about who our super funds are. So moving on to our webinar, but before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are all joining from today. Both Brock and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. But also, as normal, please feel free to pop in the chat the name of the lands you are joining us from today. And we'd also love to understand our audience. So feel free to let us know what your role is and why you've joined and taking this special time out. So what an excellent session today, and a focus that's really important moving into 2025 that I'm also incredibly passionate about as a workplace mental health practitioner and psychologist is psychological safety. So over the past few years, there's been a lot of discussion around workplace psychological safety, psychosocial safety, and psychological health and safety. So quite a lot of terms there, Brock, and it can be really overwhelming for a lot of workplaces, incorporating all the legislations and the regulations and the continual movement around what constitutes good mental health within workplaces. Sometimes can be, again, very overwhelming for different styles and different numbers and sizes of teams across different industries. Yeah. But while all these terms are actually connected to creating that healthier and more supportive work environment, they can often be used interchangeably, and that can create the confusion for leaders and teams who are really trying to make those impactful changes, because they actually mean quite different things. So joining me today is to unpack the differences between these and to really deep dive into what psychological safety is all about is the esteemed Professor Brock Bastian. Brock is an internationally acclaimed researcher, author and teacher. His research and writing have been regularly featured in outlets such as The Economist, The New Yorker, Times, Forbes, Fast Company and Harvard Business Review. And he is recognised as a thought leader in the fields of psychological safety, psychosocial risk, safety culture, behavioural ethics and mental health. Brock has provided consultancy to organisations globally on issues such as workplace mental health, integrity, workplace behaviour and workplace culture, and has developed some amazing programs drawing on the very latest knowledge within psychology. Overall, he's a top bloke. He's someone I really look up to, just with the amazing knowledge and wealth, but it's the way you deliver it, Brock, that is just so special to me, and really sings to how to relate to the likes of me. And I really welcome you on today's chat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into some of the questions that Brock and I have talked about offline, we're hoping to have questions at the end. Brock and I do love to have a chat. Don't worry, those questions will be answered either at the end, but if we do run out of time, we will certainly address those questions, and our lovely Steph Thompson is behind the scenes also able to moderate that. But let's start with the clarifying concepts, Brock. So as I was saying before, that overlap in how people talk about psychological safety and psychological health and safety, and then psychosocial safety. How would you define the differences between those?
a great question, isn't it? And you want, it's no surprise that people criticize us psychologists for coming up with psychobabble, isn't it? Because we couldn't have done a worse job of trying to confuse the space with all the different terms, really relating to some quite different things. Yeah, so certainly, I think when if we start with psychosocial safety, or even more broadly, psychological health and safety. I mean, that's really that piece uh, around an organisation's approach to supporting its people's well-being and mental health, taking I guess across all the different aspects that you would need to consider. In terms of making sure that your people, your most valuable asset, are being looked after well. And of course, that has a range of benefits that we can talk about in terms of, productivity, performance, engagement, all those sorts of things. More recently, the term psychosocial safety or psychosocial risk has obviously come to the fore, again, because of some of the changes in the work health and safety regulations. Organisations are now, have that positive duty to get in front of quite a broad range of factors, workplace factors that can impact on people's mental health. So these range from people's roles and how those roles are designed and managed through to the interpersonal aspects of feeling supported by your team or your manager, and including culture and including some of the physical aspects of work that it can impact on people's mental health too. So that's, in a sense, the sort of, I suppose that's sort of looking very much at the workplace environment. Then you've got psychological safety, which has been around, for a while and really was developed. It was developed, well, before Amy Edmondson, but certainly Amy Edmondson brought it forward in some of her research. And it was developed in that risk management space, particularly in hospital settings. And it was that idea that, it's hard to manage risks if we can't I suppose it's the idea of taking those interpersonal risks of speaking up, raising issues and concerns. These can be uncomfortable conversations sometimes. They can sometimes be, I suppose, those sorts of courageous conversations we need to have, but feeling safe to be able to do that, and not like you're going to potentially have some sort of comeuppance from your leader or the organisation because you said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person and it wasn't appreciated. So I guess in a sense, it's about that idea that people can take interpersonal risks. And I like that idea because it helps you to sort of think about, well, what do you need to do to manage the downstream risks, whether it's across a range of risks, really. But if we're talking about psychosocial risks, how do you manage the downstream impacts on people's mental health? Well, you take the interpersonal risks upstream of talking about these things and addressing them early, and making sure that that's done in a way and people feel safe to be able to raise their concerns in that manner. So it's really, I suppose, in that sense, it's really an attribute of culture, which itself is a little bit of I guess a furry term for people. But and of course, culture can itself be a psychosocial risk, but this is a particular attribute of culture that I kind of think if psychosocial risk is what do we need to be looking at and what do we need to be addressing, psychological safety is a bit about the how. What are the sorts of cultural assets and capabilities we need to be able to bring that forward.
I love the how. That is so important about looking at culture because, what does a psychologically safe team show? That there's that opportunity, as you said, is to be able to have that trust within the workplace to be able to speak up.
Yeah.
And without doing that, that you can be at risk again for those psychosocial hazards, but also it's the enhancement of the role, isn't it? It's again that the ability to then be able to innovate, because without that conversation and without challenging each other in a healthy manner, that's within a safe parameter, how do you grow?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's almost, I mean, that the word safety and psychological safety is a little bit of a misnomer almost, because it sort of suggests it's about protecting people and making sure people are comfortable and no one's ever sort of exposed to, I don't know, difficult conversation or being challenged, or having difficult feedback. I think psychological safety is about achieving an environment where there is feedback happening, flowing in all directions, and of course well intended. It's not that we we want to provide well-intended feedback, but that process is enabled. So it's not about keeping people comfortable. In fact, it's sometimes about stepping into discomfort and having quite candid conversations with each other, but just having that sense that there's always that sort of that respect, that integrity underlying that we can step into that space. We might even ruffle each other's feathers a little bit, but we'll get through it, we'll manage it, and we've got those sort of that foundation there to protect that.
I love that what you just said before there, Brock, is it's not about keeping everyone comfortable. And I think that when we think about to feel safe, that we need to wrap people up in cotton wool, and we need to be but continually being sometimes that leader, that we can have a look at, when we can say that we say have that leader that's like a little bit more draconian, or the one that says you would do as I say, we can sometimes focus on that, and that to say that how unsafe people can be, but it can also be the other end, isn't it? It can also be the ones that, show too much appreciation, and that can actually then create a team of complacency and people that good's good enough. And so therefore, and I like that the matrix that Amy Edmondson, shows that it really highlights that quite well, is that we can be in the comfort zone, we can actually have high safety, but if we've actually got the low leadership, we end up being in the comfort zone, and that's not what psychological safety is about.
No, that's right. That's right. So it's being too empathetic, sort of not ever addressing the issues, protecting people, and of course, that's where, when it comes to thinking about risk management, also that you can't manage risks in that way. You're not going to be able to step in and have those critical conversations you need to, and raise those issues and concerns that need to be raised in order to have those addressed. So it leaves those risks, and often they stay there underground until something sort of blows up.
Yeah. And what would, it is psychological safety, we talk about that being misunderstood. That is it. What other common misconceptions have you come across when you've worked with, global teams? Any examples that you might want to share with the audience today? And they can start to understand how it might look in workplace.
No, for sure. So I think certainly the comfort one is one. That idea is about protecting and keeping people safe. The other is I think, because people sort of, well, I think we all sort of struggle sometimes to understand culture, what culture is, where it is. How can you point to it? Can you measure it? So I think the idea, sometimes people talk about it in a very individual way, like like this person doesn't make me feel psychologically safe. And I think that, I can understand how people use it in that sense, but I think it's not properly applied in that sense. And also it becomes a kind of difficult conversation to talk about psychological safety when we're talking about the way you make me feel. I mean, that might be a conversation we need to have. But psychological safety is more about the culture that we're having that within, and I suppose that sense within the team. And look, we're all very good at picking up on culture. We're very, very sensitive to this. And in fact, as humans, we're incredibly sensitive to the norms and expectations that might exist in a particular environment. So we do pick up on these aspects of culture, including whether this is an environment which is psychologically safe or not. So I think one of those misunderstandings is about individuals. I mean, certainly individual behavior contributes, but when we're talking about it, it's really talking about this kind of cultural attribute of an organization, and it exists at that level. I think another one is that it's just about speaking up, about getting people to speak up. And of course, you can also, I guess people talk about speaking up fatigue. Okay, I keep speaking up and nothing changes and nothing happens, and what's the point? And so, we do know that when it comes to speaking up, there are two things that make it hard or stop that. It's not only fear, so that I suppose that sense of not feeling safe to speak up, but it's also the sense of futility. So, yes, I can take the risk of speaking up, and maybe you'll make that safe enough for me. But if you're not going to do anything with that, or if nothing ever happens, I've heard the word, sometimes people explain it as, it kind of goes up into the cloud and disappears, And so that's a futility piece. And you put those together, why would I take a risk if there's no point in doing so? So it's a perfect equation for staying silent, and you don't hear from people. They don't stick their neck out on issues or raise those concerns because, well, there's no point. So I think, to build it, that consultation piece and that constant feedback piece, if you raise an issue as a leader, you need to come back to people and create that full circle. And even if you can't change the world, which none of us can, to be able to come back and say, here's the steps I've taken, here's what we're doing. Look, I'll come back and update you again. So I think that's really, really important, not just addressing the fear, but also addressing the sense of potential futility that nothing happens anyway. So yeah, I think maybe, those sorts of they're probably some of the common misperceptions that I've come across, in particular around the concept of psychological safety.
But how important is that? Like, that exactly what you said is that we want to be able to build a culture where you're going to have different individuals that are going to actually have that courage to speak up. And then you're going to have the individuals or the other teams that might be still kind of standing back and potentially waiting to see what might actually happen. So you've always got those observers. Now, with the interaction between, say, the courageous individual and the leader, if that leader then executes on what that employee says and they do it within a timeline that everyone can then see, that's that part of that social norm kind of theory, isn't it? And everyone else would then be able to follow. So it's so important as a leader to be able to take things into consideration, whether or not you believe and we've also been in those innovation conversations, haven't we, where we can ask people, say, actually bring your worst idea to the table and let's see as a team how we can flip that around to making it the best idea. And this is all around, allowing people to have the courage to challenge each other to be able to get to a conclusion. So that's it's a really important piece, even just to take away now, if you are that leader or one of those team managers on the call, is that how quick is your feedback? Because it's really important that people feel heard, but actually they're also feeling that that whatever they've brought to the table is being taken seriously.
Yeah, and a really concrete thing I think that leaders can do, and sometimes we misunderstand. So one of the things we always say, as leaders, often is we might say, "Look, my door is always open." Now, that's nice to know. It's nice to know your door is open, but what I need to know is, what does it look like when I walk in there and I give you that uncomfortable piece of feedback, or I raise that sensitive issue? When that door closes behind me, is it a honey trap? I don't know what it's going to actually be like. So what you need to do as a leader is give me the data. Give me some data that I can work with to know what it looks like to engage in that process with you. And I think there's a couple of ways that leaders can do that. I think one is starting with anonymous feedback. So you might, create that anonymous process, but then you take those key anonymous points that people have raised and you feed it back into the team or in a team discussion in a way which makes it very clear you're very comfortable with this. And you might even find that in that session, someone's going to put their hand up as, actually, that was me, because they now feel, well, why not, right? What's the point of not putting my hand up and acknowledging that was my point? And then people will start putting their names to it, or maybe coming to you directly and in more ad hoc ways. So I think you can demonstrate it in that way. Another way that in some of Adam Grant's research and his colleagues' research is to actually, rather than invite feedback, is to share feedback, or just maybe to share something that you're working on or you think you could improve at. So this idea of sharing feedback, again, provides that evidence for people, in vivo, of what it looks like when you're dealing with something that's a little bit uncomfortable, something you could improve at, and, allows them to see, okay, well, this is actually quite safe. You can manage that quite well. And if I needed to add to that with something, then you'd be good at being able to take that and listen to it. And certainly, as an example, I've worked with some executive teams, and one of the CEO of the company, they run these town hall meetings, and no one would ever say anything, no one ever raised the issues. It was crickets. And so one of these meetings, he started off by saying, well, look, here's something that I think that we could be doing better, and in particular I could be doing better, and this is what we're doing to work on this. And all of a sudden it opened up and people felt a lot more safe to say, well, what about this and this and this? So, I think, again, that sense of, sometimes if we're not hearing much, or if there aren't, if there's no, if it's all positive, if all we're hearing around the workplace is all positive, that might be a good signal that we don't have a lot of psychological safety, because there's going to be some, less than positive elements to people's experience of work they need to raise and have resolved. But they may not feel, if we're not hearing about it, perhaps they don't feel safe to raise that.
100%. Yeah, they're not bringing the whole self to work. A great, also important, I love Adam Grant's work as well. I've just reminded me, I just want to read the new book that he's brought out. It's around that leader self-awareness piece. Like, that's a really important aspect, to acknowledge that we're not I think as well, leaders sometimes need to go in this to say, we're not there to have all the answers. And if we actually don't ask our team, and we don't have that forum to be able to ask our team where they feel comfortable responding,
Yeah.
how are we ever going to find that answer? And, we do,
Yeah.
again, it's super friend in our think tanks where we bring the coal face to certain, we want to bring experience. We don't want to bring perception.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's so important that sometimes we leave leaders out of the room to say, you're not supposed to actually have the answers. You're supposed to have the good team that is sometimes on the ground to tell us and to bring back their experiences. Then
Yeah.
we actually formulate the solution. But without that, there sometimes can be that disconnection or that gap. So I love that, that leader understanding that level of self-awareness, and not so much their fault, but it's just a gap in their knowledge, and that's okay.
Yeah, and even if it is, even if you have stuffed up as a leader, I think often if you ask people, what's at risk if you were to acknowledge you stuffed it up, you got it wrong, you made a mistake, and most people say, oh, well, my reputation, it's on the line. But actually, the research suggests that when people refuse to back down, they're viewed as unintelligent. And when people reveal both their successes, but also their failures, they appear confident and competent. So there's a couple of things about my reputation that I want to protect in the workplace. It's my intelligence and my confidence and my competence. So our intuition runs in the wrong direction. Actually, the Teflon people are not people we like or respect. They don't make us feel safe. They're not, the people nothing sticks to, and they never take responsibility for anything. So people who really own it well. And if you think about someone you really look up to and you really value, that they're people who are really good at this, and they'll go, yep, absolutely my fault. Look, I'll take that on board, or I'll take responsibility for that. And that doesn't diminish your perspective on them. It actually, it actually improves it. And I like the idea, and again, I think Adam Grant talks about this, the idea of confident humility as a tool for doing that. It's not the idea that you're saying I'm not confident in myself as a leader, but I'm not also blindly arrogant enough to think I've got all the answers and I'm never wrong. I've got that confident humility. I bring some humility to my leadership, which allows me to acknowledge, look, maybe I stuffed that up, or yeah, I didn't have the answer, or I didn't know that. And maybe your suggestion's better. And then that feeds very much into that culture where people feel safe to be able to, to contribute, to again raise issues and concerns, ask questions or whatever.
Love it. Yep. A good leader can always admit their mistakes. I've got that written on that's on my board. The authenticity piece is
yeah. Yeah.
it's a simple tool, and it can require even a bit of help and a bit of advice along the way, for leaders if they are having problems or challenges overcoming, even being able to get that there. So
Absolutely.
yeah, look, it's I love all this, Brock, and I'm always mindful of time because I know we can chat forever. But look, from your perspective, what practical steps can teams and workplaces take to enhance both psych safety and psychological safety, but also psychosocial safety at the same time, even though there is those different concepts there. Any frameworks or tools that you've used, and even found particularly effective for building these environments?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I mean, there's so many different elements to the psychosocial safety piece. The different risks that are there for people, I think, require nuance and understanding, and sometimes a different approach. But certainly, and as we've been saying, look, we know that leadership has a huge impact on people's mental health at work and their experience of work. So certainly working with leaders to help them just simply to understand that role that they have, and how that can impact on their team and people around them is a really important piece. So that leadership piece is really important. I think also, what we need to be doing, one of the things that again has been happening and needs to have happened in the psychosocial risk space is that organisations have been, running their surveys, doing their risk workshops, identifying their, the risk, developing the risk registers, putting the controls in place, which is all really important to be doing. But it's also a point in time, and in the next sort of 6 months, things are going to change. Things get, there'll be dynamic shifts in terms of people's experience of work. And so leaders do need to know how to manage those sorts of issues and concerns in a business as usual approach. So I think building that capability into the leadership of an organisation, and I think, the leaders that are going to have the most influence over that are going to be the local area leaders, the ones who are most exposed to people in their roles. They're the ones, again, we need we need the executive leaders and the more senior leaders to understand what's required and what the overall goals are, and of course to practice this themselves, because they'll have a big influence too. But we can't just stop there. I think we've got to go right down, and it's the managers, it's the people who are, it's the people that other people are reporting to on a daily basis. They're the ones who have the most influence over people's experience of work, but also are able to identify where those issues or risks are. So helping, I think, building those skills into their approach is really important. I suppose that's about effective communication, good tools for managing conversations. Again, probably one of the the trickier aspects to psychosocial risk management is the interpersonal space. I think it's the one we all kind of struggle to know what to do with. It feels very personal, it's very uncomfortable, but when we don't step in and deal with those issues early, they do end up becoming bigger, and you might end up with bullying and discrimination and harassment claims. But I think what I use and we use is a behavioural ethics framework to try and unpack this and understand, well, what's the role of intentionality in this, and how can we understand it a little bit differently? And when we look at it from that sort of, I suppose, human-centered approach, we can see that and I think the best way to step into this is to sort of say, look, most people don't wake up in the morning and think to themselves, who am I going to bully, discriminate, and harass today, right? Most people. There's a couple, and that's a different discussion. But I think we can safely assume that by far on average, in fact, the vast majority of people don't have that intention. So if they don't have that intention, how are these things happening? It's not that people are just making it up, or that's not a, I'm not sort of saying people's experience of these things is not real. It is. It's entirely real. But these things start small and they build and they build, and those interactions, when people don't know how to step in and have that discussion around how people are impacting on them or the team, how the leader maybe is impacting on the team. That's a really important discussion, and probably the hardest one to have. So those interpersonal aspects, and I think having that sort of some of those behavioural ethics or sort of behavioural insight sort of approach is a human-centered approach to understanding that, it's often the situation. Again, when we're under stress is a great predictor of incivility in the workplace. That's going to be sort of something to address and identify in that conversation. And so I suppose having those safe conversations around some of these trickier issues is really important, and having the frameworks and tools to do that well is really important, because there are 1,000 ways that we can get it wrong. And once you get this wrong, and you head down the wrong track, and people, perhaps take offence at your attempts to open up that conversation, or that don't know how to resolve these issues together, obviously these things can just get worse and worse. And once you have to step outside of a local area resolution process and you need to bring in HR, of course, it just piles on, and your time and the costs and the impacts are just just increasing. So I think these are the sorts of tools that leaders particularly need to have, because again, in my experience, it's the one thing that most people go, oh, don't know how to. I don't know how, and I don't want to really. If I could avoid it, I would. And I mean, I can identify. I think we often think that way. So yeah, I think certainly there's a range of things that we can put in a toolkit in that business as usual approach to managing these sorts of things. And of course, for leaders again to understand their role in shaping people's roles in their teams, and what does a good role look like? What does good work design look like? What are the factors in a job that are, that actually support people's mental health, and understanding those, and having critical conversations focused on those specific issues, not just how you're going and how's work, but do you feel supported? How are your levels of job demands? Do you have sufficient control or autonomy in your work? These are the sorts of things, and you can look at the smart work design model to actually think about, well, what are the specific areas I should be checking in with on people, and having those sort of focused conversations. So I guess in that sense too, we want to build that psychological safety so people can speak up and raise the issues to us, but we don't just want to sit on our hands and wait for that to happen. And in fact, we have a positive duty and obligation as leaders to actually be consulting with people proactively. So we need to step out there and ask people about these things, as well as make sure they feel safe to raise them with us if they need to.
There is just so much there that so much insight that, like part of my key takeaways, which I really love, is that it's not a static assessment. It's not just let's let's just test here and then let's test here within a certain timeline, because so much changes. It's also part of, the onboarding experience. We can give people a pack, and we know this even just with EAP, that the smallest thing is to give people an onboarding pack. This is how you start. Whereas those checking points need to be continuous.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then a lot of, leaders say, well, that's just another thing that I now need to understand, like I need to add to, as a string to my bow, or as, as part of another process in my already overburdening week. But it doesn't need to be like that as well, because it's around about that consistent framework that can have those continual check-ins that can actually even be automated, and on those to get that continuous feedback loop. The situational and interpersonal, when you can bring a new person into a team and they can have a completely different cultural background or personal experience, that can change a dynamic pretty quickly within a team. It needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be accepted that this is how we work as a team, and this is what respect constitutes, and this is when to talk up. But I also love the fact that, as you said, leaders don't come to intentionally, bully and harass. But if you don't have that level of awareness that you're doing it, and it's a slippery slope, isn't it? Because we can, as humans, be dismissive again around us. Oh, they're just stressed. Oh, they're just having a hard day. And we want to be empathetic, but it's continually occurring.
Yes.
Don't let it fester.
No, you've got to step in and address it, because again, if you don't, as I sort of, I mean, there's this great, the cognitive bias codex. It's got this wheel of biases we all suffer from, and there's 188 of them, in fact, and you can actually download this, put on your wall, just to remind yourself of how flawed your decision making actually always is. So, if I look at that, I think to myself, well, and the great thing about it is it's all unconscious, right? So you don't even know when these biases and these blind spots are occurring. So what I would really hope is I've got a great team around me who feels safe to come in and tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, Brock, I think you've missed something, or I think you're not seeing how you're impacting on this situation, or perhaps, whatever that might be. I'd hope that they would feel safe to be able to tap me on the shoulder and let me know. And of course, I'd hope that I'd have the capabilities to respond well to what can be quite an uncomfortable and difficult situation, right? None of us like to receive constructive criticism. It's never a comfortable thing. It's always uncomfortable. But of course, it's in those uncomfortable spaces that we're growing and we're developing and we're improving. So if we're not stepping into those uncomfortable spaces together, if we don't feel safe to do it, we're not growing, we're not improving. And I suppose that's why psychological safety has also been linked to innovation and creativity and performance, because that's how you do that. You step into and have those candid, uncomfortable conversations in order to be able to develop, improve, and get better.
Yeah. And even those reflections, isn't it? So, after having those conversations, I have when you have had those difficult conversations, using that bit of affect labeling to understand how am I feeling right now. So, I'm actually feeling quite humiliated. And but you know what, that's actually normal. So you can incorporate that level of self-compassion in there. The Teflon leader, which I'm going to definitely use as well. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, and I think if you think, even if you think about the value of emotions, so positive emotions, the information attached to positive emotions is pretty much the proverbial thumbs up. It tells you you're going well and keep going, right? That's what that kind of positive emotion is telling you. When you get feedback and it feels good, it's that. When you get feedback and it feels uncomfortable, you're feeling anxious or worried or humiliated a little bit, perhaps, or, embarrassed. What that's telling you is there's a whole lot of information here for you to attend to, and that's a really valuable thing. So actually, those emotions, they're the ones that all the information that you have to act on, they're attached to those emotions. They can't be otherwise. So then you also are able to say, okay, well, this feels quite uncomfortable, but actually, where's the value in this for me? Because it's actually a very valuable experience, but you can't have it without the discomfort. You can't get that without feeling uncomfortable. So thinking about how you respond to that is important, particularly as a leader, but I think, for all of us in teams as well.
What another good question that I'm going to put on my corkboard. Where's the value in this for me? So that's it's part of the growth mindset, isn't it?
It is.
We don't want to walk away. We don't want to start to become defensive when we're starting enhance this.
That's right.
You talked just and mentioned before about the, measuring that impact. Once workplaces start to take this action, and they can start to build out the framework, address the interpersonal relationships, understand what constitutes respect, and whatever the expectations are set, and create that level of feedback. How do they measure that impact of improved safety on both employee well-being and even business performance? As the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different, I suppose, different points at which you can try and measure that impact. And so some are more proximal, and some are more distal in terms of where you're going to see that. I think one thing I do say to leaders is a bit of a self check-in and litmus test is if you want to know if you've got enough psychological safety, ask yourself, could most people on your team walk into your office and give you feedback on your leadership style and how it's impacting on them and the team? Now, that's a pretty uncomfortable conversation to have. But if you think that people, and again, maybe check in with them, because sometimes we make that assumption that that's the case and it's not. But that's a good litmus test as to whether you've got enough of that and in your team and in your practice. But of course, we can also measure culture. We talk about culture as being this sort of amorphous thing. We don't quite know where it exists, but we can definitely measure it. And there are measures, including Amy Edmondson has, some published measures that we can adapt or use directly to capture the level of psychological safety within an organization or team. And there has been a call for, for I guess, performance indicators for leaders to actually include some of these sorts of things. So if we only, and again, we get what we measure in organizations. If we just measure leaders on sort of outputs and outcomes, they may achieve those, but how they're achieving those, and whether the process through which they're doing it is leaving people in the wake or not, is really, really important. And of course, it's also important for the bottom line of an organisation too. We know that the turnover is very expensive. A lack of engagement is hugely expensive. And there was some research over the period of COVID showing that culture was 10 times more important for employee retention and engagement than salary or remuneration. So, culture is incredibly important for how much people are willing to put in and whether they're willing to stay in a workplace. And of course, that has big impacts. Doesn't take too long to look at the cost of absence or the cost of turnover for an organisation, the bottom line. And of course, you haven't even then started to look at the improvements in performance, innovation, creativity that we know are there. So I guess there's ways to measure it directly in terms of the culture of a team or people's perceptions of that. But you can also start to work down and see how that starts to impact and make a business case in terms of how it's impacting on a range of those bottom lines. And that's, again, how you can raise that to your CFO or whoever else in terms of articulating a business case for why we need to look at this. And I think there was a period in time where, people didn't pay much attention to this, but I think that's over. And I think we all know pretty well now that, that humans are the biggest asset of any organization. If you don't look after them, you don't do well. But the challenge is getting upstream and putting the resources in upstream, because you're not addressing problems when you do that. You're building capability. You're building organizations that flourish. If you look at all those psychosocial risk factors and you turn them on their head, you've actually got an ideal workplace. So if you do those things well, you're also building an ideal workplace. Psychological safety is not just good for addressing those risks. It's also good for building, building that sense of ownership, that sense of belonging, a range of positive factors. People want to be working and come to work in psychologically safe workplaces. So there's a lot of benefits to these things, as well as addressing those risks. But we do have to get upstream and make the case for investment, that sort of early intervention and prevention approach to I guess, managing these sorts of things, building these capabilities in. But of course, downstream, you'll have some significant cost savings if you do that.
Yeah. We're noticing as well, like a lot of CFOs are now coming more so to the table, understanding that, and because we can quantify the culture. And I think that you mentioned last time we chatted around the Royal Commission report, what did Hayne mention? Culture 371 times.
Yeah, that's right. So again, managing ethical and integrity risks, culture is very important there and has been acknowledged as such. So, and you're right. I mean, it's a measurable construct. We've been measuring it within psychology at many different levels, including at the level of nations for a long time, and including different dimensions of it. So we can easily measure a culture. And yeah, again, there's an idea that it's sort of something that we just can't influence and we can't measure. And I like to use the words sort of, particularly for leaders, of being intentional and explicit in terms of setting the culture, or understanding, hey, you can actually be quite intentional and explicit in influencing the culture of your workplace. And sometimes we sort of sit back and think, well, it's just the culture. I can't do anything about that. But actually, I think, particularly as we move up through the hierarchy, we have a big influence and an oversized shadow on the culture, and we can actually take those intentional and explicit steps to setting the tone.
Brock, there's so many more questions I actually want to ask, and I could do that all day. But I know time is precious, and thank you everyone for joining. But before we hand it over and open it to the floor for a couple of questions, I've got so many takeaways, but three key takeaways from this discussion that you might like to, that really highlighted to you to go, oh, yeah, I remember that now. Like, that was actually, when we can talk about our key takeaways, it always kind of brings at forefront to our mind. So, what did it bring for you, this conversation today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, just that making those distinctions and just thinking through sort of what are the various elements and how do they interact is really important and critical, and just pulling, and I think that that confusion just doesn't allow people to sort of see those different components to this, which I think are all really critical. So I think that's always, that for me was sort of something that stood out. And I think also just, yeah, as you noted, and again, something that I think is important in my way of thinking about this is that, when we are managing risk, we've got to take that human-centered approach to it, that behavioral approach to understand the sources. It's a design-based approach ultimately to understanding where risk lies and how to address it. But also, just I suppose the critical importance of building those capabilities into leaders and into teams to be able to do it, on a day-by-day basis. It's those risks aren't sort of point-in-time risks. They're always there. They're in every aspect of our work, and we need to know how to step in and address them and continue to address them in that dynamic way. So yeah, it's probably
And that's a really good kind of segue into Sebastian, who's actually asked, what tools involving tech is out there that you would recommend to assess, follow, measure psychosocial risk in the workplace, just so then we're continually getting even that feedback, that lead,
yeah.
measuring that, psychological safety, whichever one you want to choose to chat about.
Yeah, well, there's quite a few tools out there at the moment. I mean, some are. I think one thing is that it is important to use the sort of appropriate tools. So certainly Flourish DX is one that's out there at the moment, and there's a whole platform that comes with that, and it's very focused on not only assessing the hazards but also being able to quantify what the risks are. Again, hazards and workplace hazards, they exist. We can't always eradicate them, but we do need to understand what risk they pose. So that's, I think, a very good tool. But of course, there are a range of other measures and tools out there. I know sort of government organisations often rely on the People Matters survey, and there's certainly elements of that capture those sorts of psychosocial risks as well. But I think ultimately, if you're wanting to sort of assess whether a tool is appropriate or not, have a look at the list of psychosocial risks that exist in the regulations, and check in on whether that tool is actually asking directly about those types of workplace factors. And not only whether they are there, but also assessing the risk that they may be posing for people. So that and again, I don't think we can infer those sorts of things from simply an employee engagement survey, which I think sometimes people might think that we can or try to, but I think we do need something more specific.
Yeah, love it, love it. Brock, we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately, and I know there are a couple of other questions. What we might do is we'll collate those, and we'll be able to, have some Q&As and be able to share this with the rest of the audience. So please be patient for everyone who has put out their well thought out questions. Thank you so much. I've learned, like normal, so much about you and you know and even thinking about, you know, the behavioral ethics framework. I mean, what an important component. So if anyone also wanted any more information about Brock and you know the work and the interventions that you do for workplaces, please reach out to us. But thank you so much for everyone for joining it. I hope you've got as much as out of it as I have, and we love hearing your feedback. We're continually curating webinars to be fit for purpose, and really wanting to hear what others are needing right now in the industry, and this is what we love, your feedback as well. We know we can't get it perfect every time, we're trying, but Steph will then send a little feedback form in the chat now, and please, if you have that moment just to complete it, that just gives us some insights into further innovating these Wellness by the Water coolers. Brock, pleasure's been all mine. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day, everyone, and hope to chat with everyone soon.